Reverend Dr. Frederick Wezeman, Jr. is the next person we're going to introduce and invite up to speak. Reverend Dr. Frederick Wezeman, Jr. is the son of Reverend Dr. and Miss Frederick Wezeman. And the senior Dr. Wezeman was the principal of Chicago Christian High School from 1927 to 1951. Fred resides in Palos Heights. He's a member of Christ Community Church in Lamont. He's the father of Frederick III of Holland, Michigan, and Bethany Krasman of Naperville, both graduates of Chicago Christian High School. Fred is a graduate of Hope College. He earned his MS and PhD degrees in clinical anatomy from the University of Illinois at the Medical Center. He earned his MDiv degree from the Chicago Theological Seminary. Fred is emeritus professor, Department of Orthopedic Surgery and Rehabilitation at Loyola University Stritch School of Medicine, where he was a faculty member for 35 years. Fred has served as a board member of New Brunswick Theological Seminary, Northwestern College, New Leaf Resources, and the Arthritis Foundation of Illinois, and he's currently the president of the board of directors at Elam Christian School. Why don't you put your hands together and invite up Reverend Dr. Frederick Wezeman.
Thank you, Joe. God doesn't answer every prayer. This morning I prayed that I wouldn't go first. But I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. When the committee asked me to participate, I met with Connie Brott and asked Connie what I should say. And she said, well, if you could cover the early history of the high school from 1918 until about 1943, and someone else will follow after that. And then would you talk about your father's vision and about the programs he began and about his philosophy of education? And then would you talk about a little bit about his style of discipline and some of the humorous stories about that? And then would you make an introduction for us? And I said, well, sure, I'd be glad to do that. Connie, how much time do I have? She said, 5 minutes. So that's not going to be possible. But I did look at the program from the 1928 10-year anniversary of Christian High. And in that program there were 4 speakers, one of whom was my father. And down below the names of the speakers that evening, printed in the program, was the statement, speakers will only have 5 minutes. So I guess the DNA of Christian High program development is deeply embedded. And I'm going to try. I probably used up already most of my 5 minutes, right? But I am glad to share with you just for a few moments the early history of the institution. In 1918, everything came together after about 5-6 years of planning. One of the prime movers in that planning process was Jim DeBoer, who was my father's brother-in-law. And Jim DeBoer was quite a figure in the business community, the Dutch business community, and a lot of contacts, and he mobilized the whole effort to encourage the development of secondary education for the youth, for the Dutch youth of the south and the west sides and the suburban areas and Roseland and so forth and so on, opportunities that went beyond elementary school. He and many others felt that secondary education was mandatory in those years. So they basically began the high school under charter in 1918, and those years were interesting because they started out in a wooden building at 72nd and Loomis and soon outgrew that facility. They had 2 faculty members, one of whom was the principal, Mark Fakema, and one other faculty member, and 14 students. And then the second semester it grew to 28 students, and they outgrew that little wooden building at 72nd and Loomis. So they moved to a dance hall at 69th and May Street. And they renovated that for additional classrooms, and the school began to operate there, and the enrollment continued to increase. And they used also the basement of 2nd CRC Englewood for additional classroom space, and they kept growing and growing. So finally, after 9 years of temporary location, they decided to raise the money. And again, Jim DeBoer mobilized a lot of the interests of the community, and they raised $100,000, and the shovels dropped at 71st and May Street, and they built the beautiful building that still stands today. So that was the early beginnings of the school, they hired my father, the board hired my father in 1928. He was a lawyer practicing in Chicago, was called to the ministry, was a graduate of Calvin Seminary and the University of Chicago Divinity School, and he came on board as the president in 1918. So, I'm sorry, in 1928. So basically he brought with him a vision for Christian education for the youth of the community, and he began to increase the faculty. He began to introduce the programs that he felt very strongly about. He introduced busing to help the families get the kids to school from the distant suburbs and from the west side and from the far south side. He began in 1931, he proposed to the board the development of Chicago Christian Junior College. It was a forerunner of a college, a local Christian college that could be basically serving the needs of the Dutch community, and not only the Dutch, but others as well. So Chicago Christian Junior College started in the classrooms of 71st and May Street, but then they also had to expand downtown, and they rented a building on Randolph, just west of Michigan Avenue, between Michigan and Wabash on the north side of the street. The building is still there, and that's where the junior college held classes as well. So it grew up to about 250, 300 students were engaged in college education. And again, Dad's vision was to produce to direct the development of even more opportunities for the youth. So he started Union College of Law at the same locations, both at 71st and May and downtown. But the clouds of the Depression, the Great Depression, were forming, and things got worse for the high school. Enrollments dropped. People were not able to pay tuition for either high school or much less the college or even the professional approach. So opportunities were being sacrificed because simply income wasn't there. The faculty were paid about $800 a year. I don't know how many of you out there are faculty now, but I don't know if you could live on $800 a year, right? And tuition was about $60 a year, so $30 a semester. But families couldn't pay the tuition, so enrollment dropped. Some faculty had to take smaller paychecks. I'm glad, though, that one teacher at Christian High in those early years, during the early parts of the Depression, was basically paid. Even though my dad was being paid by IOUs, not all the time, but occasionally, had to forfeit his income so that the teachers could get paid. But one teacher that he did pay was a young woman by the name of Gertrude Harmling from Oostburg, Wisconsin, who became my mother. So I'm very glad she got paid. And I'm sure the tongues wagged heavily. And she went on, after they were engaged, to teach at Morton to slow down the wagging tongues. The 40s very quickly were very interesting years. In 1942, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands exiled to England to escape the invading German armies, and Princess Juliana exiled in Canada. And during that year, in the May of 1942, Princess Juliana was invited to Chicago, and my dad invited her to the high school, and it was quite an event. And I'm sure that many of you know that. Many of you perhaps were there. But that was very notable to have Princess Juliana, the future queen of the Netherlands, there. And it hit the newspapers heavily, so there was a lot of advertising for Christian High. A few years later, my dad was knighted by Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands for his support of the Dutch heritage here in Chicago, as well as for his support of the Dutch resistance during Nazism in Holland. So that briefly is just a few minutes of the history of the institution. I just need to tell you, to satisfy Connie's charge to me, one little story. Maybe some of you were involved in this story, but one day my dad was walking down to his class one morning to teach Bible, and he arrived at the door of the classroom, and he reached down and he wiggled the door handle, and it was locked. So he looked through the window, and he could see all the students sitting in the class with their heads down, and they were studiously looking at their work. And so Dad wiggled the door once more, and no heads looked up, and there was no recognition of Doc there at the door. So he tried it one more time and still no response. So he turned around and he went down to his office. He came back with a baseball bat. And Dad did a Babe Ruth through the window of that room. And of course, the students didn't really expect Reverend Dr. Frederick H. Wezeman to enter the room that way, right? So in came Doc, and they felt we're going to really have to pay the price now. Dad said nothing to them. This was his style of discipline. He casually walked in after he unlocked the door from the inside through the broken window, and he walked in and he sat down, and he started his lesson, didn't say a word. I have an idea, though, that the text that he used for that Bible class was switched over to something about guilt and forgiveness, don't you think? And that was his style. He loved the kids. He nurtured them. He fathered them, in a sense. He understood them. He understood where they were coming from. He understood their sense of humor and fun. So that's the historic, funny story that I could come up with to satisfy Connie's charge. Is there anyone in the room who was in that classroom? Maybe not. Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to reflect on my dad's 25 years at the high school and the ability that you've given me to reminisce for a few moments. Every time I think about Christian High, I think of Psalm 16, verse 6. Truly, we have a good heritage, and isn't that the case? We have a wonderful heritage. The institution has been blessed greatly. God has been so faithful to this institution. To God be the glory.